Let me start with a picture you have probably seen, in your own yard or your neighbor's. It is the first week of August, and a bed of black-eyed Susans that was a solid sheet of gold a month ago is turning black from the ground up. Not gold with a few bad leaves. Black. The spots started down low where nobody looks, and now they are climbing leaf by leaf until half the planting looks scorched. And here is what unsettles people. It did not happen to one plant. It happened to every plant in that bed, all at once, in the same week, as if somebody flipped a switch. Most folks blame the weather. Too much rain, too humid, bad luck. Friends, it is not bad luck. That whole bed went down together for a reason. And once you hear it, you will never look at your flower borders the same way again. Because in a great many American gardens, that bed of black-eyed Susans is not really many plants at all. It is one single plant, photocopied 50 times over. And a photocopy has one fatal weakness an old prairie never had. Welcome back to Golden Harvest, where the whole idea fits on a seed packet. Feed the soil, not the plant. I am not here to sell you a bottle of anything, because the best things in a garden are free, and most of the time the fix is not something you add, it is something you finally understand. So pour a cup of coffee, pull up a chair next to me at the edge of the bed, and let me walk you through the 10 things worth doing to your black-eyed Susans as August begins. Not busy work. 10 jobs that decide whether these plants carry your garden into October or quietly turn to compost by Labor Day. And I will give you the why behind every one, because a reason you understand is still working 10 years from now, long after a memorized tip is forgotten. If that is your kind of gardening, tap subscribe so the next one finds you when your garden needs it. Task number 1. And nobody tells you to do it first. Before you water, before you cut, before you worry about a single spot, figure out which black-eyed Susan you actually own. Because black-eyed Susan is not one plant. It is a last name shared by a family of very different plants that look alike in a photo and behave nothing alike in the ground. Most of what garden centers sell under that name is one of two things. The first is Rudbeckia hirta, the classic roadside black-eyed Susan, the one in wildflower mixes, sold in little 6-packs every spring. And here is what nobody at the register tells you. Rudbeckia hirta is not a long-lived perennial. It is short-lived, often a year or two, sometimes a single season. It was built to bloom hard, throw a fortune in seed, and let its children take over. When a hirta vanishes after a couple of years, it did not fail you. It did exactly what a short-lived prairie plant is supposed to do. You just expected a perennial. The second is Rudbeckia fulgida, almost always the variety called goldsturm, the true, spreading, come-back-every-year perennial most people picture. It travels by underground stems into a dense clump, and that word, goldsturm, will matter more than any other in this video, so hold on to it. There are others, Rudbeckia triloba, the brown-eyed Susan that seeds itself beautifully, and the tall giants Laciniata and Maxima. But today the question that changes everything is simple: short-lived cedar or spreading goldsturm clone. Because from here on, the right answer to almost every task flips depending on which is in front of you. Task number 2. Learn to read those black spots, and then learn why chasing their exact name is a trap the garden center would love you to fall into. On those lower leaves, the most common culprit is a fungus called Septoria rudbeckii to be exact. It shows up as small dark brown spots, an eighth of an inch or so, always starting on the oldest leaves near the soil. Give it warm nights, heavy dew, and a little splashing water, and they multiply and march up the plant until a leaf is more black than green. There is a second common one, angular leaf spot. Its lesions more squared off, where they hit the veins, and a few others besides. Now most videos spend 10 minutes teaching you to tell these apart. I will save you the trouble, because the plant doctors at the University Extension Services are refreshingly blunt about it. The symptoms are so similar, you often cannot separate them without a microscope, and here is the kicker: it does not matter, because you manage every one exactly the same way. Chasing the precise name, as one extension writer put it, is more of an intellectual exercise than a necessary step. So here is what helps, and what does not. What does not help much is running for a fungicide in August once the spots are already climbing. By then, you are closing the barn door after the horse is gone. A copper product can help a little, but only as prevention. early in the season before symptoms show, never as a cure once the plant is covered. What genuinely breaks the cycle is the next 3 tasks, and it is all free. Nobody sells a bottle labeled airflow. Task number 3 is not a chore, it is the single idea that makes sense of everything else. Why does the whole bed go down at once? Come back to that word, goldsturm. Goldsturm is not grown from seed. It is multiplied by division and tissue culture, which is a fancy way of saying every goldsturm plant sold in this country is a clone, a cutting of a cutting of a cutting, tracing back to one original plant selected in a German nursery the better part of a century ago. So when you plant a drift of 15, you did not plant 15 individuals. You planted the same individual 15 times, one genetic code copied straight down the row. Now think what that means when disease blows in. In a wild prairie, a stand grows from seed, and every seed is a fresh genetic shuffle. Some plants carry better resistance, some worse. When septoria arrives, the susceptible ones spot up, and the resistant ones shrug it off and carry the population forward. The prairie hedges its bets. That is what genetic diversity buys you. Insurance. A bed of goldsturm has no insurance, because there is no diversity to draw on. Every plant has the identical weakness, so they do not fall one at a time. They fall together, in the same week, as if somebody flipped a switch, because in a sense somebody did. You planted a monoculture of one, and the extension offices know this so well that when a gardener writes in about a goldsturm bed going black every year, the advice is not a stronger spray. It is to replace it with a more resistant kind, or better yet, bring genetic variety back into the planting, which is exactly where we are headed. So tell me in the comments, have you ever watched a whole patch go from gold to black in a week and blamed a bad summer? I would bet you were looking at a photocopy. Task number 4. Now that you know how the disease travels, you can cut its legs out from under it with a rake and a handful of mulch instead of a sprayer. Here is the mechanism, because the mechanism is the whole game. Those spores do not blow in from 100 miles away. They spend the winter right there in your bed, on the old infected leaves and stems left lying on the soil. Then every time a raindrop or a burst from the sprinkler hits that debris, it splashes microscopic spores up onto the lowest fresh leaves. That is why the disease always starts at the bottom and climbs. It is not falling from the sky. It is being launched off the ground, one splash at a time. Break the splash and you break the disease. 2 free moves do it. First, pinch off the worst spotted lower leaves and get them into the trash, not the compost, because a cool backyard pile will not kill the spores. You are removing the launch pad. Second, lay an inch or 2 of mulch, shredded leaves or bark, over the soil around the crowns. That mulch is a physical shield between the spore-laden soil and the underside of your leaves, so the splash has nowhere to land and nothing to pick up. Keep it pulled back a couple of inches from the stems, so you are not trapping wet against the crown. This one habit, every year, does more than any fungicide I have seen, and it costs nothing but a few minutes. Task number 5 follows straight from the last. Water the ground in the morning, and never the leaves at night. When you stand there in the evening spraying over the top of the planting, you are making rain. You are recreating by hand the splashing that launches those spores up the plant at the worst hour, because leaves that go into a warm, humid night wet stay wet for 10 or 12 hours, and a wet leaf overnight invites every fungus we have talked about. So water at the base, where the roots drink, with a can, a soaker hose, or a wand held low, and do it early so the sun dries any splash within the hour. And before you even reach for the hose, push a finger down 2 or 3 inches. Cool and damp down there? Walk away, they are fine. Overhead evening water is very often the problem wearing the mask of a kindness. Task number 6. Deadheading, and this is where owning the wrong answer can quietly cost you the whole planting, so pay attention, because here is where task number 1 pays you back. If you have the spreading goldsturm perennial, deadheading through the season tidies the plant and nudges a bit more bloom, and the clump comes back next year regardless, because it returns from those underground stems. So deadhead if you like the look, right up to the last flush. But if you have rudbeckia hirta, the short-lived one, listen closely, because the common advice will hurt you. Every video says deadhead everything, all season, no exceptions. Do that to a hirta, and you may be signing its death warrant. That plant is short-lived. It is not coming back from its roots. The only way it carries on is by dropping seed and letting the next generation rise. Snip off every flower before it can set seed, and you get a tidy plant this year and a bare, empty patch next year, and you will swear it just up and died on you. It did not. You sterilized it. So the honest rule is the opposite of what you were told, and it depends on which plant you own. On a short-lived hirta, ease off the deadheading as the season turns and let the last flowers ripen into seed. On a goldsturm, you have more freedom, but there is a good reason to leave the final flush standing too, and that is task number 7, my favorite of the year. Before we get there, tell me, do you deadhead every last bloom or leave them stand? Give me your state and growing zone with your answer, because the right move in Minnesota is not the right move in Georgia, and I read every one. Task number 7 turns a fragile photocopy back into a resilient prairie, and it is completely, wonderfully free. Right now, as August begins, walk your bed and pick out your mother plants. Here is the thinking. If the trouble with a monoculture is that every plant shares the same weakness, the fix is to bring variety back, and the cheapest source of variety on earth is a seed. But not just any seed. You want seed from the plants that earned it, so look for the individuals that, in the thick of disease season, still look cleanest, holding the greenest leaves, and standing strongest while their neighbors spot up. Those plants are telling you they carry a little more natural toughness, and it can be handed down. Tie a strip of ribbon around your 2 or 3 best performers right now, so you can find them again in a few weeks. You are doing, in your backyard and for nothing, exactly what a plant breeder does. You are selecting for resistance. Then let those marked plants keep their flowers. Do not deadhead your chosen mothers. Let the seed heads dry and darken through late August into September, and when they are brown and crisp, snip them into a paper bag, dry them indoors a week or 2, and crumble the seed out. Scatter it where you want more or where a bed went thin, and let the winter cold do the rest, because these seeds actually need a spell of cold, damp weather to wake up and germinate come spring. One caution to keep this honest. It works cleanly with the straight wild species, because their seed comes back looking like the parent. Save seed off a fancy-named hybrid, and goldsturm counts, and the offspring come back scrambled, or barely at all. So save from the plain species, and let the photocopies be. Now here is the part that ought to make you a little angry, in a useful way. Nobody sells this. There is no product called genetic diversity, no patent on a resilient seed patch, no way for anyone to make $1 teaching you to grow your own black-eyed Susans for free from the ones you already own. And that, more than anything, is why you have never heard it. It is not a conspiracy. It is simply that the most valuable thing you can do here is economically invisible. Task number 8 is quick, but it is the one job here you cannot put off until tomorrow. As you walk the bed, watch for a flower gone wrong in a particular way. Not spotted leaves. We covered those. I mean a bloom that comes out green, sickly and deformed, sometimes with strange little leafy tufts sprouting right out of the flower where petals should be. That is a disease called aster yellows, and it is a different animal. It is not a fungus you manage with airflow. It is caused by a microscopic organism spread plant to plant by tiny sap-feeding insects, and once a plant has it, there is no cure. Here is the mistake people make. They snip off the one ugly flower and leave the plant standing. But the infection is in the entire plant, roots and all, and every day it stands there. Those insects feed on it and carry the disease to every healthy plant nearby. So when you are truly sure, the whole plant comes out, that same day, roots and all, to the trash, and not the compost. It is the one ruthless act of the season, and it protects everything else in the bed. If you are not certain, your state extension office will identify it from a clear photo, often at no charge. Task number 9. In most of the country, the Japanese beetles are out in force right now, and black-eyed Susans are on the menu. These beetles have a nasty little trick. When they feed, they release a scent that calls in every other beetle in the neighborhood, so one beetle today genuinely becomes a dozen next week. Early and steady is how you win, and the best control I know costs nothing. Take a small bucket of soapy water out on your morning walk, hold it under a cluster of feeding beetles, and tap them in. Early morning is ideal because they are cool and slow, and their instinct when startled is to drop straight down, right into your bucket. Two warnings that matter. First, do not hang those beetle traps anywhere near your beds. The research is clear the scent lure pulls in far more beetles than the trap catches, so a trap by your garden just invites the whole neighborhood to dine at your place. Second, do not spray an insecticide on plants in bloom. Those open flowers are covered in bees and butterflies, and a spray does not read the label. It kills whatever lands there. We feed the soil and protect the pollinators here. Those are the same fight. Task number 10. 3 mistakes to consciously not make this month, and the last comes with a twist that ties this whole video together. Mistake 1. Do not divide your clumps in this August heat. Goldsturm and the spreading types genuinely benefit from being dug and split every 3 or 4 years. It reinvigorates a tired clump, and here is the lovely part. Dividing also opens the planting up and improves airflow, which quietly makes it one of your best disease tools. But the time to do it is the cool of fall or early spring, never the baking middle of summer when the plant has the fewest reserves to recover. And notice the contrast. If you also grow coneflowers, those you cannot divide the same way because they run on a deep taproot instead of spreading stems. Same-looking prairie flowers, opposite rules, which is the whole lesson of today. Know the plant, not just the tip. So for now, if a clump is crowded, tie a ribbon on it as a reminder and put it on the calendar for late September. Mistake 2. Do not cut a healthy plant to the ground. Every green leaf still standing is a little solar panel, banking the sugars that fund this year's flowers and next spring's return. Take off the spotted, the dead, and the damaged. Yes. Leave every healthy green leaf where it is. Mistake 3, and this trips up the most caring gardeners. Do not reach for fertilizer to rescue a struggling plant. A black-eyed Susan looking rough in August is almost never hungry. It is far more likely stressed by disease, or crowding, or too much water. Dump high nitrogen on that and you get soft, weak, floppy growth. Precisely the tissue those leaf spot fungi love best. You will have fed the disease, not the flower. And this is the heart of it. A black-eyed Susan grown in living, healthy soil does not need rescuing with a bag of anything. Feed the soil, and the soil feeds the plant. It always has. So here is the whole month in one breath. Find out which black-eyed Susan you own, read the leaf spots without wasting money on their name, and break the splash with cleanup, mulch, and morning ground watering. Deadhead by species so you never sterilize a short-lived herta. Mark your toughest plants now, and save their seed, and pull any aster yellows plant the same day you are sure. Knock the beetles into soapy water, and skip the summer dividing, the scalping, and the panic fertilizing. Every bit of that fits into a slow, pleasant walk with a bucket and a pair of snips, and not one of it needs a thing you have to buy. Because the big idea I hope you carry to the garden is that you were never tending a row of individual flowers. You were tending the health and the honest genetic variety of a little population. Manage the population, feed the soil beneath it, and these plants hand you gold from July through the first hard frost, and a fresh crop of their own children for free besides. Now before you go, do 2 things for me. Tell me in the comments which black-eyed Susan you are growing, and whether you have ever had a whole bed spot up on you at once. And here is one to argue about, because I know some of you will. Do you deadhead every bloom, or leave them for the birds and the seed? Say your piece, and your state and zone with it. One honest word before I let you go. Everything here is general guidance from a fellow gardener, not a rule for your exact backyard. Your local extension office and your USDA hardiness zone are the final word on what grows and what threatens it, where you live, so lean on them. They are good people, and most of their help is free. If you reach for any product at all, read the label and follow it. And if this handed you a new way to see your flower bed, subscribe and ring the bell so the next walk finds you when your garden needs it. Until then, go feed your soil, and I will see you back here at the edge of the bed.